Well, I could not be more proud and happier than to introduce our first stellar of the festival, Tim Tingle.
And give a special big round of applause to your next storyteller, who, when I said, I forgot to have the chair up for my drums, she said, I'll bring it up for you. Give Barbara McBride-Smith a great big round of applause. Barbara, you got more applause than I did. What? Makes more sense, doesn't it? I am Choctaw. I'm Oklahoma Choctaw. My great-great-great-grandfather was 10 years old. His name was John Carnes, and he survived the Trail of Tears, or I wouldn't be here today. And as honoring, I started back in the early 1990s traveling to Mississippi. Misha is a Choctaw word for place. Sippy is a Choctaw word for old. So when you say Mississippi, you're saying the old home of the Choctaw people. You're speaking Choctaw. So I started traveling back there, and I met a man named Archie Mingo. And he took me to Ninewaya, our Choctaw sacred mound. And it's a beautiful place with wooden steps leading up to it. And at the base of it is a sign that says, as long as the people return to this site, the tribe will grow and prosper. It's supposedly there are different stories about it. One is that the bones were buried there from several deaths, and the other is that where we emerged from the earth as people. And as I drove him back to his house, Mr. Mingo said, and right across there is a river through those woods called Bok Chitto. And he began to tell me what happened across the Bok Chitto River. There's a river called Bok Chitto that cuts through Mississippi. In the days before the Civil War, before the Trail of Tears, Bok Chitto River was a boundary river. On one side lived the Choctaws, a nation of Indian people. On the other side, plantation owners with their slaves. And if a slave escaped and made his way across that river, the slave owner could not follow. That was the law. And so it was that long ago and far away, when the river was the boundary, one Sunday morning, a Choctaw mama woke her little daughter up saying, Martha Tom! Oh, ma'am, I didn't mean to make you jump. You know that wasn't deliberate, not at all. Martha Tom, you get yourself up, you take this basket, throw your dress on, you go pick me some blackberries. I have a wedding to cook for today. Now go. Martha Tom jumped up, threw her dress on, ran to the river. She saw a bush full of blackberries. She picked every blackberry from the bush, and then she heard it. She knew what that was. It was the beast that must be fed. She sat down, she picked the first blackberry up, she held it over her shoulder, she leaned her head back and opened her mouth and dropped it. She ate every blackberry in the basket. For the beast that must be fed, of course it was her tummy growling. And there were no more blackberries on her side of the river. So she did something she'd been told never, ever to do. She went crossing Bok Chitto to the slave side. For the only way to cross that river in those days was a stone pathway just beneath the muddy surface of the water. And only the Choctaws knew it was there, for they had built it. And when the river flooded, they built the stones up. And when the river sank in times of drought, they built the stones down, always unseen beneath the muddy waters. One slippery stone at a time, she made her way deep into those Mississippi woods. She filled that basket with blackberries, then looked to the sky for the sun to lead her home. But it was cloudy. She was lost. And then she heard something. She heard people moving through the woods. She thought, maybe they're going to the river. I'll follow them. She followed the sound, but she couldn't see the people. They weren't going to the river. They were leading deeper into those woods. She came across a clearing headed by a stump covered in grapevines, and logs rolled out almost like they were benches. She looked, and then she heard someone coming right behind her. She jumped behind the stump, And stepping out of the woods came a skinny little African-American man with a bushy head of white hair, hobbling on a cane. She hid behind the stump. And as he walked around the stump, she moved around it. He could hear the crackling of the leaves. He turned around and tried to run the other way. She moved, and then he stopped. He leaned his cane against the stump and stepped up on it. And she thought, if that old man steps up on that stump, he's going to be able to look down and see me. So she jumped into the ground. Oh, ma'am, it's just part of the story. I didn't mean to make you jump again. I'm sorry for that. But, she had to jump into the bushes quickly so the man wouldn't. Anyway, she jumped into those grapevines, and as she looked up, that old man started clapping his hands. And then he pointed to the woods, and he said, we're bound for the promised land. And what happened next changed her life forever. First, she heard voices coming from the woods, unseen voices like spirit voices, bound for the promised land. She thought, must be Shalombish, must be spirits. What is happening? And the old man started clapping and pointed the other way, bound for the promised land. Here come the voices, bound for the promised land. And then the old man started clapping and stomping. He lifted his hands. He said, who will come and go with me, bound for the promised land? And as Martha Tom looked through the leaves and saw 100 families, slave families, mothers and fathers holding their children, it was the calling together of the Forbidden Slave Church deep in those Mississippi woods. And they began to sing softly that song, bound for the promised land, I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the promised land. The music was so beautiful. It touched her so deeply. And then something else touched her on the shoulder. She looked up. It was a big man with a big chest, so big it was about to pop the buttons off of his shirt. He looked at her and he said, you're lost, little girl. And she said, yes. He said, you're Choctaw from across that river, Bok Chitto. Yes. What's your name, little girl? Martha Tom. Well, Martha Tom, I'll get my son, Little Mo. Little Mo! And Little Mo appeared. It was a tin little boy, just like his slave dad. He was African-American. And he said, Little Mo, get this little girl. She's Choctaw. Get her to that river, and she can find her own way across. She did before. Little Mo said, I better not, Dad. The men in the plantation house, they tell us if we're seen playing close to that river, our whole family gets in trouble. I better not do it. But his father wasn't daunted. He knelt down and pulled the boy close. He said, son, there's a way to move amongst them where they won't even see you. Here's what you do, son. You move not too fast, not too slow, eyes to the ground. Away you go. They won't even see you, son. It sounded like a fun little game to play, so Little Mo took Martha Tom by the hand, and off they went, just like his daddy had taught him. Not too fast, not too slow, eyes to the ground. Away you go. They came to that riverbank, and Martha Tom thought, this will be a funny little game to play. So she took him right to where the stone pathway was, knowing he couldn't see it beneath the muddy waters. And she said, Little Mo, you stand right here, and looky what I can do. And she turned and started walking to the woods. He said, okay, little miss, looky what I can do. Maybe you better turn around. That's how you got in trouble. What do you do? I don't see a boat or a bridge. How are you going to cross this river? And she said, wait a minute, look. She flipped her hair, and she took off running to the river. And he said, little girl, you better stop. I can't even swim. If I just, oh, what? Stop. She jumped from the shore. She landed on the water. He jumped back. She stood up. Little girl, what kind of a witch are you? He said, I'm not any kind of a witch. Come on. No, I hear my mother calling. I better go. No, stop. Okay, but don't turn me into a frog. I'm not going to do that. No, come here, little Mo. He stepped to the shore. She said, little Mo, I would never hurt anyone in your family, any of your people, if your father hadn't found me in the grapevines. I would be their next little slave. And little Mo looked at his skin and looked at hers. And then she said something that most people still don't know, but it's so true. She said, who do you think were their slaves before they brought your people here? It was us. I would never hurt you. You can trust me, little Mo. I want you to meet my people, my family. And little Mo looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he decided to trust someone of a different color. He put his foot through the water, and when it touched the stone, it was como milagro. It was like a miracle. And every step was a miracle. And finally, when they reached the center of the river, little Mo said, how long has the path been here? She said, I don't know, maybe forever. And he thought, and the path to freedom is always there if you learn to see it. The path to freedom is always there if you learn to see it. Martha Tom led him to the wedding that was already taking place. They heard the beautiful wedding chant. Way, hey, ya, you, hey, ya, way. Hey, you, hey, oh. She led him back across the river, and this began a friendship that would last for years. As every Sunday morning, Martha Tom would cross that river, she would sit with little Mo and his family through the church, and on her way home, she would sing that song. In Choctaw and English both, she would sing it. Then trouble came. There was a slave sale, and 20 slaves were sold to go to New Orleans the very next morning before sunrise. The men were called to the back porch of the plantation house to listen to the names being read. Number 17 on that list of 20 was little Mo's mother. As his father took the longest walk of his life and walked up the hill, he was about to open the door when he stopped and he realized, I have one gift to give my family with any meaning tonight, our final meal together in happiness. So he stepped inside the door and forced a smile on his face, and his wife said, what took you so long? I made your very favorite white bean stew, and there's cornbread, and we found some honey. Come on. He nodded and smiled and said the prayer with joy in his voice. When the last bit of cornbread had swiped the final bit of beans from the bottom of the bowl, he stood behind his wife and said, there has been a slave sale. She said, who? He said, 20 people leaving for New Orleans before sunrise tomorrow. Who? She said. He turned away. People we know. He said, yes. Who? He didn't answer. She put her hands on his cheeks and moved his face where she could see the tears welling up in his eyes. And she said, just say it. He looked at her and said, you. She said, no. She jumped up. She said, I'll grab my things and run to the woods. He said, you don't want the children to see the dogs drag you back. She said, no. And she was storming around. And the children began to cry. They'd never seen their parents this way. And then little Mo said, Dad, there's a way we can stay together. The Choctaws will take us in. His father said, son, they'll have guards out tonight to prevent the river crossing. Daddy, listen, please, just for a minute, just like you taught me. Not too fast, not too slow, eyes to the ground. Away we go. We have to try, Dad. For Mother, we have to try. He said, you're right, son. He grabbed pillowcases, tossed one to every member of the family. They threw their things in the bags. But the people in the plantation house had seen them working. They surrounded with dogs and lanterns and guns. So when they stood looking for leadership, the father looked to the back door and said, we could go out that way. It might be dark and safer there. But this night's journey is not about darkness and safety. It is about faith. It is about freedom. We will go out the front door. And so they did. And when they pushed the door open, the men tossed their jackets from the lanterns and lifted their shotguns under orders to fire. But no people they beheld. A miracle happened. This family became invisible. All the way, so close past the men with the guns, and the dogs could sniff the air, but they couldn't see them, all the way to the river. They looked to little Mo to lead them across. He said, "I've never been here at night. I can't find the way." His father pulled him close and said, son, you know we call you little Mo, but you know that's not your real name, son. It's time for you to be who you are. Your name, son, is Moses. Now, Moses, get us across that water." And little Mo smiled and dipped his arms up and down. He found the pathway. He dashed across it. He banged against Martha Tom's door, and her mother came and said, "What?" He said, "It's me, little Mo. I know you can't see me, but they're after us, the men with the dogs and lanterns and guns. Can you please help us?" She said, "Yes, I will, son. You get yourself right back across that river. Hide your family in the tall river cane. I've got work to do now. Go." He dashed across and moved his family in the river cane right on the banks of the river. And here they come, following the dogs. The men were just about to fire their guns into the river cane when little Mo's father took his hat off and wiped the sweat around and tossed it over them. They turned away, and so did the men. That gave Martha Tom's mother just enough time to went to every Choctaw house. She said, "Women, put on your white dresses, bring a lit candle, meet me at the river. We're having a ceremony tonight, the crossing kind." And soon they were standing in the fog. And when the men turned around, the men with the dogs and the lanterns and the guns, they turned around and one of them said, look there." And they saw what looked to them like angels on the Choctaw side of the river. The wind blowing their white dresses back and forth, and the candles they held casting a halo glow around their faces in the fog. And then they saw, standing up in front of them, what looked like what they were after, the family of runaway slaves. They pointed their shotguns at the slaves, but their fingers froze on the trigger. For stepping out of the fog on the Choctaw side, they saw the most beautiful little angel of them all. Her right hand held a candle. Her left hand was outstretched. It was Martha Tom, and she was walking on the water and singing a song they'd heard the slaves sing many times in the fields, but never in the language she sang it. I'll sing it in Choctaw, and you can join me in English. Start out with, "I'm bound. Nita kishtayo big mano Jesus miniti. Mala holy to pama chihotayalashki." She took little Mo by the hand, and he took his mother. She took her husband, and he took the children, and together all 7 of them went crossing Bok Chitto. When they reached the fog on the Choctaw side, they blew the candles out and disappeared into the lightness of it all, never to be seen on the slave side ever again. But in Neshoba County, Mississippi, where I first heard this story, they still talk about the big waters and the crossing and the Choctaws who helped so many slaves escape. Bok Chitto is the Choctaw term meaning big water. When I first wrote this story, I ended it this way. And a few years ago, I thought maybe I should change the ending. People will think I'm implying something else. And then someone told me, we need this ending more than ever now. We still have the big water. Closer and closer and closer we're coming, but we still need the crossing of the big water. Step by step, stone by stone, closer and closer and closer we come to the land where everybody is welcome here. Freedom. Thank you, thank you, thank you.